Welcome to the Medical Independent Innovation in Healthcare podcast series, where we explore the advances that are transforming Irish healthcare and the innovative minds behind them. From cutting-edge technologies to groundbreaking research to new models of care, Ireland is at the forefront of medical innovation. Our guests are leading figures in the Irish and international healthcare community who are revolutionising the way patients are being treated. So whether you're a healthcare professional, a patient, or simply curious about the latest developments in Irish medicine, join us for an engaging and informative discussion.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Medical Independent Innovation in Healthcare podcast series. I'm your host, Priscilla Lynch, Clinical Editor of the Medical Independent. Joining me in this episode is Professor Orla Hardiman, one of Ireland's leading researchers into neurodegenerative diseases, whose groundbreaking work is renowned internationally in the field of motor neuron disease. Orla is Professor of Neurology at Trinity College Dublin and Head of the Academic Unit of Neurology housed in Trinity Biomedical Sciences Institute, as well as a practicing consultant neurologist in Beaumont Hospital Dublin. She has almost 460 peer-reviewed papers to her name and has been the recipient of numerous national and international awards over the years. So, firstly, Orla, let's go back to the beginning and tell me about what attracted you to neurology and your specialist areas of interest.
It's a good question. Actually, I don't remember ever not wanting to be a doctor. Well, for a little period of time, I thought I might be a historian, but then I went back to medicine. So I'm unusual. There's no medics in my family at all. They're mostly artists and musicians and creators of various different types. So when I went to college, I liked the idea of what makes a body work, what makes us who we are, and when I was going through my undergraduate, I thought maybe I wanted to be a psychiatrist, and I did an intercalated year. I did a BSc halfway through my medical training and did that in physiology. And what I really liked about physiology was you didn't have to remember everything. You could work out things from first principles. If you knew the first principles, you could work out what was going on. So I really liked that. That gave me a nice sort of grounding. And also we had to do a little research project in physiology as well as part of the degree. So in the second half of my undergraduate, I became more interested in the brain. I realised that's probably where I wanted to be and thought maybe about psychiatry. But I did my internship then in St. Vincent's Hospital and I did 3 months of psychiatry during my internship and realised that the guide wires weren't really there. It was a bit difficult to be sure what you thought was actually what was really happening, and I was attracted more then to the idea of understanding the brain in a more sort of grounded, tangible way, and also it really appealed to my background in physiology as well. That if you knew the basics, you could figure out what was going on. If you knew the structure and the function of the brain, you could figure out what was going wrong. And so the idea was that in neurology that you localize where the problem is and you deduce from your clinical examination and your knowledge of the nervous system what the problem is, and then you can figure out where to go from there. So that's what attracted me to neurology, was that idea of knowing the basics and being able to figure out from there.
It's often seen as a very intimidating specialty and it's also very broad, but you were particularly attracted to the diseases that maybe, particularly at the time when you entered medicine, would have been seen as kind of a hopeless cause.
Yes, I think that is a bit later. I mean, what attracted me to neurology was probably what attracts most people to neurology, is that idea of structure and function and neurological deficit. When I did my training in the US, there was a kind of a joke. It's not really a joke, I suppose. You learn your neurology stroke by stroke, so the loss of function was allowed us to understand what the function of the brain that was in which the deficit arose, what that function is. That's not actually entirely true. It's very anatomically based, and I've moved on in my thinking from that point of view. So I think that if you think about medicine in general, actually, this idea that we can fix things and make them go away completely is something that we learn as medical students, and we medical students get to understand diseases for which there are purported treatments. But if you think about the vast majority of what people come to doctors for, they're mostly diseases that are chronic and manageable but not curable. So if you want to cure your disease, you become a surgeon. And if you want to, if you become any sort of physician, the majority of workload is taking care of people that have chronic conditions and that you manage. It's not that common to cure anything other than infectious diseases as a physician. And then, of course, in neurology, we look after people with um, episodic deficits and fixed deficits. But most people with neurological problems, the problems um, are chronic and long lasting. That doesn't mean that you can't help them, though. It means that you can engage with them and walk the walk and walk the journey and ameliorate the symptoms to the extent that we can. And we do that really well in some diseases, for example, in Parkinson's disease. And over the course of my career, we've got to a point where some diseases really do make a difference. For example, in multiple sclerosis, over the course of my professional career, MS has gone from being a disease where we could do very little except use steroids in the context of a relapse and hope that the relapse would get better, to really effective disease-modifying therapies, at least for the relapsing remitting form of the disease. So even in the space of my professional lifetime, we've seen a disease that was really um, very frightening for people and associated with a lot of uncertainty and the likelihood of a lot of disability, to a condition where people live their lives really well with minimal disability because the treatments are so good now. So so I think that's been a really exciting part of my career as well, is to look at diseases where this has really been happening and being able to be part of that story, and then working in diseases where we know that could happen if we work hard enough to do it.
And you've been at the forefront in Ireland specifically of trying to bring those treatments to patients first and being involved in clinical trials, which is something that it's not always been an easy task in Ireland. I suppose if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how that's changed over the years.
Yes, I mean, Ireland had a bad reputation. Apart from the Cancer Clinical Trial Network, which John Crown set up, as you know, we had not a very good reputation for conducting trials in Ireland, and that's partly to do with the infrastructure. When I started out, we had no clinical research centres either, and there was no recognition of the need for this being a discipline of it in its own right. Clinical trial development and clinical trial delivery is a discipline in itself. It's an entire professional discipline, and the idea that you could, hire a registrar for research purposes and have them do a bit of clinical trial on the side is erroneous. It's unfair to the registrar. It's unfair to the trial, and our uh, the way that we sought or tendered for trials up to a number of years ago was on that basis. So I think more recently there's a recognition with the advent of the HRB and Wellcome funded CRC clinical research centres, that there's a resource, infrastructure and resource within those centres that you can access and that you can bring trials with the support of those resources. In my own case, actually, we have our own funded clinical trial group. So we do enough clinical trials that I can fund some nurses and a business manager and a couple of permanent clinical trial fellows. So that's what they do. They do that. They do trials and they do clinics, and that's the way it should be. So I think it's been a really exciting time. Actually, we started out doing MS trials, but in the more recent past, there's been an explosion in trials of motor neuron disease as well, and we've 6 or 7 running, either running or just about to run for motor neuron disease now. And at very early phase trials as well. We're doing a couple of phase 1 trials, which was not done up to very recently in Ireland. We've done some gene therapy trials as well, which is really exciting in Ireland to have done that. So things have moved on a lot in the last few years from that point of view.
And can you tell us a bit more about that? Because motor neuron disease, it is a horrible disease, really, to be blunt. And there is often a sense of hopelessness among patients who unfortunately do get that disease. But you've done an awful lot of work on motor neuron disease, and you've provided new insights into the complex genetic components of motor neuron disease, and particularly in Ireland. If you want to tell us a bit about setting up the patient register and how you've gone to early stage trials in Ireland.
I think when when somebody receives a diagnosis that's most likely going to be life-limiting, of course, it's a catastrophic diagnosis, and people's entire future is taken away from them, and they have to readjust their life view and the life view of their family. But my experience over the last 30 years is that um, people, um, uh, humans are really resilient. We're a really resilient species, and we can adjust quite quickly to the new parameters in which we live. And our experience is that uh, the vast majority of people with motor neuron disease um, adjust. And if we measure their quality of life using the right instruments, we can show that people can retain their quality of life. If we think about this from an existential point of view, I mean, we we live and work and trot along in our lives with the knowledge that we're going to die, but we are able to push that away from if we lived in the knowledge that everybody's going to die, and I'll be definitely dead in 50 years, and probably much shorter than that. And 50 years is a ridiculously long time from my point my age. But if we lived on the notion that even in 30 years' time I'll be dead, that would create an existential crisis. So we're able to actually push that back. With people with motor neuron disease, what we have to face up with is a time limit, which is different from the time limit that people normally would have expected. But if you can adjust to that, which people do, you can live with hope in your life after that. You can live with enjoyment in your life. So I don't accept that people are hopeless when they develop motor neuron disease. I think that people adjust their expectations in life, and people can do that really successfully. And I've been really, really, I've learned a huge amount and been regularly in awe of the way that people can do that, and that what people can teach us in facing the likely expectation of a shortened life expectancy, but yet have the resilience to live their life now and today and tomorrow and the next day. And I think that, I think that hopelessness is the wrong term. I mean, we should all be hopeless in that regard, because we're all going to die. It's a question of when and how. Um, so I think that I think that's something we should recognise in people who have life limiting conditions, because it doesn't mean that it's hope limiting, and it doesn't mean that it's quality of life limiting. It doesn't have to be. Going back to the register, so when I came back from the US in the early 90s, I came back actually to UCD, and I went back to physiology for a few years as a Newman Scholar. And I was also doing a little bit of clinical work in Beaumont, as they allowed me in to do a couple of clinics. And I set up a neuromuscular clinic because I had trained in neuromuscular at the time. And there were only 10 neurologists in the country at the time, and it was in the early 90s. And there was the neurology was really this sort of very academic discipline. The joke was diagnose, adios. You'd make a diagnosis and that's it. The intellectual pursuit was attractive to us, and the wherewithal and the infrastructure to look after people wasn't there. So one of the things that I saw that I wanted to do was to try and build a program that would not just make the diagnosis, but that would put whatever interventions that would be valuable for people to put those in place. And it was really a greenfield site. So I set up the original clinic in 1994, and then I was appointed as a consultant in 1996. So I was able to set up some additional clinics in these multidisciplinary clinics, and worked really closely with the voluntary sector at the time as well. And because I trained in neuromuscular disease, and because motor neuron disease was seen, or still is, sort of categorized incorrectly as a neuromuscular disease, I had seen some people with motor neuron disease in Boston, although my area of research was actually in muscular dystrophy at the time and cell biology. But when I came back to Ireland, I realised that actually, cell biology for a practicing clinician is not very practical in Ireland, because the infrastructure isn't there. You can't have a sort of a dual role as, a wet lab, hands-on person, and also be an effective clinician, especially on a 1 in 3 on call with 10-year-old 11. I was the 11th neurologist in the country, so looking after a population of probably about 500,000 people or more, because we were the national centre as well at the time. So we took call from everywhere in the country. So running a lab was not practical. So I shifted my research emphasis away from wet lab laboratory based stuff to epidemiology, and looking at us, thinking of Ireland as an island, with a relatively a population in which there was very little immigration, a lot of emigration, and thinking about what would be valuable and useful, and setting up the register for motor neuron disease was something that that I had discussed with the Irish Motor Neuron Disease Association, and with my colleagues. My mentor in Boston had been Bob Brown, who made his name actually on identifying the first gene that is associated with motor neuron disease, SOD1, although he also had done a lot of really groundbreaking work on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So my research interests around trying to make a difference in these diseases, neuromuscular diseases, and my interest in I've always been interested in epidemiology. I've always been interested in I'm trained. I went to an all Irish school, so Irish Irish cultural heritage is very important to me as well. So being able to build something in Ireland that we could grow in our own time, build an infrastructure that wasn't necessarily competing internationally, that we didn't have to worry about other groups scooping what we were doing, but we could grow slowly and really well. Setting up the register was a really nice way of being able to do that, with the support of the Irish Motor Neuron Disease Association and the Health Research Board as well. So I did a little work in other areas as well, around those areas. So I set up an MS clinic, so we did a little bit of work in MS as well, and some work in post polio syndrome as well. But the register was in motor neuron disease, because population was small enough that we would be able to capture everybody, and then we could set up the multidisciplinary clinic, and we would be able to treat everybody, and then we could show that running a multidisciplinary clinic improved outcome, which it does. So that's how it started.
That was going to be my next question. It's not all just about the science and being in the lab. It's also making practical changes to support patients in living their daily lives with these diseases. So you were the first to set up a multidisciplinary clinic in neurology. We're all about multidisciplinary clinics now, but you were obviously a pioneer in that area, and it really did help improve patient outcomes. And you've also all been about working in a team, which, as you highlighted there, we have such a shortage of neurologists in Ireland. It has improved in recent years, but I was very struck by a recent Irish Neurology Association conference where a speaker from Finland pointed out that even though we're similar in size and population and socioeconomic circumstances, they have 5 times more neurologists than we do. So how on earth did you have time for such innovation in your career when you're coming up against this never-ending onslaught of demand for clinical care, and then trying to sit back and, how do I understand this disease better? How do I make patient care better?
I think that I think it's really important to learn from your peers, and our peers don't have to be in the same discipline. One of the things that I found really helpful in my young career was the availability of leadership and support from women, usually in other cognate areas. So for me, setting up the multidisciplinary clinic was a no-brainer, because I didn't have all the skill sets. I was aware that I didn't have all the skill set to be able to take care of these people, and that I had colleagues in the hospital who had skills that I didn't have. And these are my colleagues in nursing, and my colleagues in physiotherapy and occupational therapy and speech and language therapy. And so when I joined Bowman First, I developed really close professional but also personal relationships with the relevant heads of those cognitive areas of in physiotherapy and occupational therapy and speech and language therapy and dietetics. And then subsequently in neuropsychology, the late Deirdre McMacken, who was a pioneer in her own right, and sadly passed away early in life. But her legacy lives on in Beaumont, in the neuropsychology department there. So it was working with the heads of departments, across the neurorehabilitation field, and also within the nursing domain, we had some really, really good, still do, nursing leadership in Beaumont. So that leadership across those disciplines for me was a huge enabler, and allowed us to work together to really learn from one another, and to have the sum of what we did being much greater than the parts that comprise that sum. And I think that may in part be to do with my own formation as a woman in medicine, because when I was growing up, all of the role models and all of the senior leaders in medicine were men. And it was difficult to see oneself, that sort of juxtaposition of being female but also being in leadership position, and looking at other leaders in other areas and being able to learn from those leaders was really helpful to me. And at the time, and I don't want a sexual stereotype really, but I think it has to do with our formation. This idea of being able to reach out to say, look, I really don't know enough about this. Can you help me? Can you help to inform and refine my perspective on what I'm doing here? And being able to do that, being able to say to other people, I don't know enough here. You need to help me. I think possibly in my generation, women were a little bit better doing that than men. That maybe changed, and I don't want to sound sexist or sexual stereotyping, but the way we were brought up, and the way, so for example, my male colleagues, my brothers, and my colleagues in going through college, that would have been difficult for men to do.
15, 20, 30 years ago, it was more difficult to sit up and say, well, actually, I want to start this. I want to do this. Let's reach out and work together, because often, medicine is seen as working in silos. But now at this stage of your career, you're very well known for your mentoring of younger colleagues, male and female, and just trying to get, I suppose, everybody involved in research early on, and that they're supported adequately and encouraged to do so.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I mean, I think when I look back at my own younger career, and I say this, one of my sons is a healthcare professional as well, he's a social worker, and I say to him, when you have a bad experience in your professional life, well, you don't get bitter, you don't get angry, you learn. You say, I'm never ever ever going to let that happen to somebody else when I'm in charge. And so I think we learn both from our positive experiences and from maybe not so positive experiences about how to do stuff. And from my point of view, um, forging ahead and trying to make a career path for which it wasn't really a path, made me feel quite strongly and almost passionately, I suppose, that the track that I leave should be, we should try and pave that over, and not let the grass grow onto it again, so that other people can follow through along the same track. It's more difficult nowadays than it was, though, in my day, because there was such poor infrastructure, and so there was so little. It was greenfield. That was negative in one way, because there was no money and very little out there. But in another way, it was actually really exciting, because you could come up with ideas, and there were enough people out there to say that's a good idea, and let's see if we can make this happen. And one of the people, from my point of view, some of my early mentors, for example, Hugh Staunton in Beaumont, was very supportive of my early career. And then my research career, Dermot Kelleher, who was head of school and dean of the faculty and vice president of medical affairs in Trinity, was really supportive. And I was in Beaumont, so that was a RCSI linked hospital. But I reached out to Dermot quite early on in the mid 2000s, and he was really supportive, and that was very pivotal to the development of my career, and also to the development of the academic unit. Dermot was one of these visionary, can-do people, where if you come up with a good idea, Dermot would support you to try and make it happen. I still had to do all the fundraising myself, and still had to put in all the infrastructure to set up the academic unit. But without the support of the head of school and the dean, that wouldn't have happened. So there are people along the way where you can, if you find them and they're enablers, you can really make things happen as well.
And you really helped put those pathways in place and those structures, which is really heartening. So those structures are there. Research is being done, really groundbreaking and internationally recognized research as well. But there's no shortage in innovation to ideas and enthusiasm. What can be the issue often is changing the way things are done and convincing those who hold the purse strings. And that's also been a big part of your career as well, because you've made these fantastic discoveries, but how do you bring it into clinical practice? How do you get it out there? And you're very well known as well as a great patient healthcare advocate. And you also set up the Neurological Alliance of Ireland as well many years ago too. So if you want to tell us a bit about your advocacy as well, that you've had to go on the airwaves and in the media sometimes when things have been frustratingly slow when you want to make these changes.
Well, just go back to the very beginning of what you said. I'd love to take credit for additional money going into research, but I don't think I can take credit for that. That's, the economy improved and SFI has become more interested in the biomedical side of things. The Health Research Board as well has had its funding. It's still not funded adequately, actually, but at least they have a funding stream. Going back to the setting up of the NAI and then the sort of advocacy movement, um, that was really sort of almost organic, but also quite pragmatic. So when I started in Beaumont, like I said, there were very few neurologists. I was the 11th, and I'd set up these clinics. It was really obvious to me that we should have people who knew what they were doing in the clinics, and that meant not just neurologists, because we're good at diagnosing, but the ongoing management of people needed other disciplines and other expertise. And I realised quite early on that the voluntary sector actually had a lot of that expertise, had a bad, my generation in our formation, we were discouraged from engaging with what were considered as patient groups because they sort of were perceived to get in the way of it. I took a different view in that I thought there was a lot we could learn from the patient groups. So when I set up the clinics, I set up the neuromuscular motor neuron disease and post polio, and I set up an MS clinic as well. And I was approached by Audrey Craven, who at the time was the chief executive of the Migraine Association, a very compelling woman, and she's a good friend of mine still, to ask me would I set up a migraine clinic. And when I looked at our data, I realised that about 30% of all the referrals to neurology were migraine, were headache. So I agreed to set up a migraine clinic, even though my training is in neuromuscular. I actually set it up with a psychiatrist, with Veronica O'Keefe, who's now a professor over in Tala, because it seemed to me like that would be a sensible thing to do, because a lot of migraine had comorbidity with it. But in the context of doing that, I invited the voluntary organisations to come into the clinic with us, and sit in the clinic and provide the support for people, the practical support. This is in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was very little out there in terms of community support, and the voluntary sectors were filling a massive gap. And the IMNDA, for example, the Motor Neurology Association, had an equipment bank, so it was actually quite pragmatic and useful to have them in the clinic, because they could provide the equipment and support that the HSE wasn't providing. And worked with MDI, Muscular Dystrophy Ireland as well. And looking at the sort of needs that people had, it became really obvious to me that all the organisations were looking for the same thing. They were looking for better patient care and better support and better buy-in from clinicians. So I got together with a few of them with whom I had worked, and we decided to put together this Neurological Alliance of Ireland. And I'd raised some money for something else, and we were able to transfer the money over to set it up. And so we kicked it off in, I think it was 1999, as I recall. And it's still going. So under the fantastic leadership of Max Rogers, who's the chief executive now, and there's over 30 organisations within the NAI now. So it was a real success story. And out of that, we were able to build this sort of a patient advocacy program. And we were, because these people in these volunteer organisations were very well skilled. There were a lot of them were founders of their organisations, and were very skilled politically. We were able to access senior political figures, including at the time Micheál Martin, who was a minister for health at the time, and got a Corlin and Hospital review of neurology. So that was the beginning of recognising that we had fewer neurologists than they had in Mongolia. and then building the program for the development of additional neurological care and services, more neurologists, but better services as well. But out of that actually came this idea, or this recognition that um, people with neurological disease had, most people had chronic illness. And it was really obvious to me that the best way to manage people with a chronic illness is within a public sector. And it was the beginning of the noughties, and there was money in the system. And I was becoming increasingly concerned about the move towards privatization of medicine. And the privatization would not support the development of services for people with chronic disease, because that model is profit driven, and it's in and out, it's intervention, um, uh, uh, payment, and then back out. And so to me, that was anathema. That was the completely wrong way of looking at how we should be delivering healthcare. So I became involved during the noughties in an advocacy with some like-minded colleagues to protect the public health system. So I worked with some of the trade unions as well, actually, and some of the more left-leaning politicians and colleagues in who had the same view that I did. And we developed a network called Doctors Alliance for Better Public Healthcare. Christian O'Malley, who was the president of the IMO at the time, who had known for many years, was also a strong advocate and a partner. We did a lot of work at that time and put out pamphlets and did public presentations and debates. I debated against Mary Harney a couple of times, diametrically opposed views.
I remember that well.
And the only thing that saved the system, actually, all the things that we predicted happened, which was that the private sector wouldn't really be able to cope with the sort of chronic disease, and the public sector would be denuded of funding. And that's exactly what happened, unfortunately. And then the crash happened, and the private sector went belly up, and the public sector didn't have any resources, and we're still recovering from that. So it was a very depressing time, actually. And I don't know that we made much success. The same issues arise today as they did 15 or 20 years ago. Some of the younger doctors have been working now along the same trajectory, and I've sent them all over our pamphlets and our slide decks. And unfortunately, they're still relevant now. They have the same relevance now that they had then. Things have improved a bit. I mean, I'm a great advocate for Sláintecare, for example. I think what Sláintecare is doing is the right approach. I think we should be moving things back into the community. I think we're excessively hospital based. I think we should respect our general practitioner colleagues. I think they should be funded adequately. I think the resourcing is top heavy in the hospitals and should be moved back out into the community. So some of the work that I've been doing more recently in my role as clinical lead is aligned with those sorts of views that I've had over the years about moving people out of hospitals, recognising the value of other disciplines, not just physicians, but the role of nursing and other clinical professionals, the capacity for the community services to provide care. And the Neurological Alliance has been working more recently on building a program around neurorehabilitation, which I really support as well. This idea that we should have really good neurorehabilitation services within the community, and that we should be able to link seamlessly between the hospital and the community. So the patient journey is not compromised. The patient journey is smooth and seamless, and the person gets the care that's of the highest quality as close to home as possible. And that's they're the aspirations of Sláintecare as well. So they align very well with my own philosophy around how we should be delivering healthcare.
And you've also been able to bring your own philosophy to being clinical lead for neurology in the HSE. What's been the most exciting part of that, and what changes have you managed to bring in?
So I think the first thing to do is to bring my training in grant writing and evidence-based care, evidence-based, which was what we do as researchers, to the idea of service development, and I think we don't pay enough attention to that as clinicians. As a sort of view, what I do is really important, and you should fund me because what I do is really important. And while that's true, we're one of hundreds and hundreds of competing voices. Why should neurology be more important than hip surgery? Why should we get more resources than cancer or diabetes? So that really began to worry me in the early 2000s. Actually, shouldn't we be working together to make a case for all of the services being improved at all of the, at the same level? So from the clinical lead point of view, I'm just about to step down. Actually, I've done 5 years, and I think it's been a good 5 years. We published a model of care in 2016. Adina O'Driscoll was the program manager, and Tim Lynch was the clinical lead. So that set the scene for where we wanted to go, and we were lucky in a way as well. I think in that the HSE is beginning to transform itself as well, and recognizing, for example, the importance of things outside of trolley counts. And so the importance of waiting lists and scheduled care, and making scheduled care practical and efficient. Um, and so over the last years, what I tried to focus on were really three things. One was geographic inequity. So there's a massive problem across parts of Ireland in the access to neurological care, particularly in the northwest, from west of the Shannon upwards. So my colleagues in Galway and Sligo are really struggling. So also in the southeast and Waterford, and in the Midlands, in the Midlands of Tullamore and Mullingar, but also in Limerick. So what we tried to do in the first instance was to recognise that, and to put in a strong case for additional neurologists. So we got 5 additional neurologists during that period of time to focus on those areas of geographic inequity. And that was successful, and those people are in post now. So geographic inequity was a really important one. The second one was recognising where the health services are going, and particularly things like Sláinte Care. And Sláinte Care put out a call for a pilot innovation award. And in my role as clinical lead, we were looking at, okay, so what do we need in neurology? Well, we need a series of, not every hospital should have a full multidisciplinary neurological service, but every hospital, every patient should have access to those services. So if we nominate, say, for example, 10 neurological sites as hubs, and we resource those sites appropriately with everything that they need, and that aligns with the CHO, the new development of regionalisation of services as well, then we should be looking to build services within those areas. And if we divide neurological care into things like rare diseases that need to be really centralised, and motor neuron disease is a very good example of that, Huntington's disease another, common diseases that need neurological care ongoing. So, for example, MS is a really good example of that, because there's so many disease-modifying drugs that need surveillance now, that people need to be linked into a neurological service. Parkinson's is another example of that. And then common diseases that could be co-managed primarily in the community, but might need some neurological input. So headache was a very good example of that. Epilepsy sits somewhere between the common that can be cared for in the community, and regional support services, and then some tertiary for epilepsy as well. So we looked at developing services along those 3 main sort of categories, and focused on headache as an example of what you might be able to do aligned with Sláinte Care to develop services. So we put in a proposal to the Sláinte Care pilot programme of trying to move the care for people with headache and migraine out of hospitals back into the community. And there's a proposal that was aligning the Migraine Association of Ireland, really, really professional and effective organisation, with the hospitals and with the Irish Pharmaceutical Union, the IPU, seeing if we get the pharmacists involved as well, and recognising the role of GPs, but trying to move things so that patients with self-care as well. And so then COVID hit. So the pharmacists couldn't really play because we were looking to gather data. But we got funding anyway, and we got funding for a number of hospitals to test this out. And based on my own experience of setting up the migraine clinic in Beaumont many years ago, we put in psychology as well. So we had a specialist nurse, psychology, and admin support, and we were able to show a really good benefit of putting in specialist nurses and psychologists into 3 of the hospitals, and also working closely with the AMAI. And based on that, we generated data, and out of that, we went to the Ita Hegarty's Pathways programme. This is part of the Integrated Care programme, and we now have a pathway for headache migraine, which is being rolled out now this year to all the hospitals with specialist nurses and psychology and admin. That's not enough. We need more, but it's a good start. So the other two pathways that have been successful, based on this idea, were the pathway I do, the motor neuron disease pathway. So that's fully funded now, a fully funded whole-time equivalent posts of all of the specialties localized in one hospital, with links to two other satellite clinics in Galway and Cork, with outreach services where the nurses are not in the hospital. They're governed by the hospital, but they're in the community, and the clinical professionals also work between hospital and community. And we're using that model then to build a business case for Huntington's. And then the third one was epilepsy, and I can't take credit for that because Colin Doherty has been working on this area along with Ronan Kilbride, who's a lead for epilepsy. But Colin is particularly interested in the vulnerable populations that are really falling out of services. And he set up this really fantastic program with Launch Care funding as well, to provide a mobile outreach clinic for people. And so the clinic goes to the person rather than the other way around. And that's been really successful and effective as well. And that's been funded now through the Pathways program as well. So that's a linkage between St. James and the Mater, looking after vulnerable people within the Dublin area. And then over time, we'll generate data to roll that out into the community.
So there's been a lot of innovation in the programme under your lead.
Not finished. In addition to that, we recognise the need, again, part of this unmet need of the regions, this problem of geographic inequity. So along with the Neurological Alliance, who put together an advocacy programme for additional nurses, clinical nurse specialists and advanced nurse practitioners. And that's been successful as well, providing funding for 21 new specialist nurses in Parkinson's and MS, epilepsy and neuromuscular disease. So all in all, we have I think 32 new nursing posts that have gone through in the last year or so. 5 consultant posts, the fully funded program for motor neuron disease, and the development of the epilepsy the outreach for vulnerable individuals. So that's all going through now. And then the next thing that we have to do is set up the training programs for nurses. We're in the process of doing that. In my role as academic, in the academic unit, and with Colin as head of school, Colin Doherty as head of school in Trinity, we're putting together a CPD program for nurses, but we're working with the School of Nursing with the view to having a level 9 program in place for neurologic disease.
So there is no shortage of innovation there. I mean, there's a number of clinical programs, and obviously it is about improving direct patient care, more consultants, more nurses, making sure there's clinical pathways there. But you've shown that there's an awful lot of innovation as well in what you can do for patients, new ways of doing things, new ways of offering services, going out to patients themselves, having patients more involved, having other disciplines working closer together. So really, it's a very exciting kind of development, isn't it? Because often, as I said there, sometimes with neurology, people just feel there's such an onslaught of demand and that we don't have enough numbers, but we are doing great things.
I think things have improved a lot since I started, and there's obviously always room for growth and development. COVID also spurred things on a lot in terms of the idea of telemedicine and telelinks. I mean, I don't think telehealth works in terms of the patient encounter. I think we experimented with that in the motor neuron disease clinic, and really I don't think we can make a clinical diagnosis on the basis of a video call. It's very difficult. But I am working with in our the other part of what we do in this SFI funded academic industry collaboration that I run, called Precision ALS, which is building a patient data platform, and out of that we will have some telelink device, remote monitoring technologies, and I'm involved in an interesting discussion with one of the industry partners around this idea of using AI maybe to help to generate an early differential diagnosis that can speed the patient into an appropriate diagnostic situation to confirm the diagnosis. So there's a lot of interesting innovation underway, using technology and working with my colleagues in the ADAPT Centre, and using computational science and data science and innovative machine learning. So I think we're working really closely with colleagues in that regard as well, and also to substratify people into different subgroups that will need a lot of technology for that as well.
So clearly you have no plans to take it easy when your time as a clinical lead of neurology finishes up. And I know you have a number of research projects that you've recently become involved with as well. So we're clearly going to hear a lot more innovative developments from you in the coming years. So I think that's a wrap now. So thanks very much to my guest today, Professor Orla Hardiman, who we could easily do another couple of episodes with. And your most recent award actually was Health Research Board 2023 Impact Award, which recognised how your exceptional contribution to research has informed policy and practice in a way that positively impacts both the care and the well-being of patients living with neurodegenerative conditions and their families. And I think that was a very appropriate win. So thank you again, Professor Hardiman, for joining me today. And please keep tuned for further episodes in this series of the Innovation in Healthcare podcast series from the Medical Independent.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe to the Medical Independent for the latest healthcare news and debate. Sign up at www.mindo.ie to stay up to date on all the latest medical news. Join the discussion on Twitter at med_Indo News. Introducing the new Medical Independent app. Why not join over 14,000 healthcare professionals and stay up to date on the latest healthcare news in Ireland? Read in-depth reports on the issues impacting the health service and medical professionals. Trusted insights, breaking news alerts, in-depth analysis and more. Download the Medical Independent app on the Apple Store or the Google Play Store by searching the word Mindo. The Medical Independent app. Your news, your way.